Let me start with a question that sounds, well, kind of impossible. Did you know that every single country on Earth is in debt? Yeah. The United States, China, Japan, Germany, every last one of them owes money. How can that be?
The number itself is just staggering. $315 trillion. To put that in perspective, that's 3 times bigger than the entire global economy. And look, this isn't just some number on a screen. It's a force that shapes our world, our politics, and our lives.
So that's the big question, right? If everyone owes money, who's holding all the IOUs? The answer to that question peels back the curtain on something pretty incredible. You see, this system we live in, it wasn't an accident. It was designed piece by 4 key architects over 300 years. Let's dig into how they built it. Our story kicks off way back in 1694. King William III of England is in a real jam. He's fighting a war with France, and he is flat broke. I mean, the royal treasury is empty. And because England had a bad habit of not paying its debts, no one wanted to lend him a dime. That's when our first architect, a Scottish merchant named William Paterson, steps forward with a revolutionary idea.
You know, before Paterson, a loan was simple. You borrow money, you either pay it back, or you default and run. But Paterson pitched something completely new, a loan where the government never has to pay back the original amount. Ever. All they had to do was make the interest payments. Forever.
So here's how his plan worked, step by step. First, Paterson gets a group of rich merchants to pool their gold into a new private bank, the Bank of England. The bank then turns around and lends that gold to the king for the war. In return, the government guarantees an 8% interest payment every single year, paid for by the taxpayers. And that original loan? Poof, it never has to be repaid. The bankers basically bought themselves a permanent income stream, guaranteed by the full faith and credit and taxing power of the British government.
But here's where it gets really wild. The truly brilliant move was this. The Bank of England was then allowed to print paper banknotes, not backed by gold, but backed by the government's promise to pay interest. Think about that for a second. Money was now being created directly from government debt. The more the government borrowed, the bigger the money supply could get. Paterson had just invented permanent national debt.
Okay, let's fast forward about a century to 1815. Paterson's model has caught on, but it's still pretty localized. Our second architect, Nathan Rothschild, is about to take this idea and put it on steroids. He's going to globalize it.
So what Rothschild did was pure genius. He created a market for government debt. Instead of a loan being just between a king and a bank, he turned these government IOUs, bonds, into assets that could be bought and sold by anyone, anywhere. Suddenly, the ownership of a country's debt was a complex, tangled web that stretched across the entire globe.
And the story of how he cemented his dominance is legendary. It's 1815, the Battle of Waterloo. Thanks to his private network of messengers, Rothschild gets the news that Napoleon has been defeated a full day before the official word reaches London. He walks onto the stock exchange floor and, very publicly, starts selling his British bonds. Everyone else panics, thinking Britain must have lost, so they dump their bonds too. The market crashes, and then Rothschild's agents secretly swoop in and buy up everything for pennies on the dollar. The next day, when the official news of victory arrives, the market goes through the roof, and he makes an absolute fortune.
And here's the real kicker. Because of Rothschild, default became almost impossible. See, now a British bond might be owned by an investor in France, who's using it as collateral for a loan from a bank in Prussia. If Britain defaulted, it wouldn't just be one bank that got hurt. It would set off a chain reaction, a domino effect that could bring down the entire European financial system. The web was just too tangled to break.
All right, let's cross the Atlantic and jump ahead to America in the early 1900s. The economy is booming, but the banking system is like the Wild West. After a massive financial crisis in 1907, a crisis that J.P. Morgan himself had to step in and fix with his own money, he and his buddies on Wall Street decided they needed a more permanent solution, a solution that would put them in control.
So they held a top-secret meeting on a private island, Jekyll Island, and they hatched a plan for what would become the Federal Reserve. Now, they were smart about it. Americans hated the idea of a powerful central bank, so they wrapped it in a brilliant disguise. They called it federal, but it's privately owned by the banks. It looked decentralized with 12 regional branches, but the real power was, and still is, right there in the New York Fed, controlled by Wall Street. It was a masterclass in marketing.
But the real magic trick, the true power of the Fed, was this. It could literally create money from nothing to buy government bonds. Before, a government's borrowing was limited by what people were willing to lend. But now, the government had a buyer of last resort that could never run out of money. This was the mechanism for infinite debt. The natural limits on government borrowing had just been removed.
So let's jump to our final architect. By the 1970s, the whole system is global, but it's starting to show some serious cracks. Developing nations had taken out massive loans in US dollars, and with rampant inflation, they were about to go under. The whole system was on the verge of collapse. That is, until the Fed chairman at the time, Paul Volcker, came up with a way to install the final lock on the cage.
To kill inflation in the US, Volcker did something unheard of. He hiked interest rates to a jaw-dropping 20%. It worked in America, but it absolutely crushed developing countries. Their dollar-denominated loans suddenly became impossible to repay. When Mexico threatened to default in 1982, which would have taken down some of the biggest US banks, Volcker orchestrated a solution. He used the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, to step in with new loans. Not to pay off the old debt, no, but just to give them enough cash to keep making the interest payments to the big banks.
And this became the new playbook for global finance. Don't forgive debt, just restructure it. In exchange for these bailout loans, countries were forced into structural adjustment. They had to cut social spending, sell off public assets like water and electricity to foreign corporations, and basically hand over the keys to their economies. The debt trap had now become a direct tool for control.
So let's put it all together. You have these four figures from four different eras, but they weren't working in a vacuum. Each one laid a brick on top of the last, constructing the massive financial system we all live inside today. It's a clear progression, right? In 1694, Patterson made debt permanent. Then, in 1815, Rothschild wove it into an interconnected global web. In 1913, Morgan gave it an infinite fuel source. And finally, in 1982, Volcker made it truly, finally inescapable. Each step locked the door a little bit tighter.
Which brings us right back to where we started. Let's take the U.S. national debt, $38 trillion and counting. Who actually holds all that debt? And maybe more importantly, who's cashing the interest checks?
Well, as you can see here, more than half is held by the public, big financial institutions, and the Fed itself. Now, you might see that other chunk, U.S. government itself, and think, oh, we just owe it to ourselves, no big deal. But really, that's just money in government trust funds like Social Security. And when those bills come due, guess who's on the hook to pay them? The taxpayer.
And this, right here, is the bottom line. Every year, hundreds of billions, soon to be $1 trillion, are taken from taxpayers just to service the interest on the debt. And where does that money go? It flows directly to the holders of the bonds, the big banks, the huge pension funds, the global asset managers. It is, quite simply, a massive, silent, and continuous transfer of wealth from labor to capital.
So when you see that $315 trillion number, don't think of it as a problem that needs to be solved. That's not how the architects saw it. It's not a bug in the system. It's the entire operating system. Every single dollar of that debt is an asset on somebody else's balance sheet, spinning off interest payments. The great secret is that the debt was never, ever meant to be paid back. It's the system, and it's working exactly as it was designed.